Hi, everybody. Um, Thank you to Prema. Thank you to Sujatha and the Kalarama board for inviting me to speak. I am feeling very humble up here. Based on the luminaries we've had speaking so far, I am very much a student standing up here. That being said, this presentation is the sort of summarized outcome of my forthcoming doctoral thesis, becoming a doctor in divinity. And so what I found in my Ayurvedic and astrology practice is a lot of what I end up doing is in the realm of spiritual counseling. And so trying to figure out how to better do that. And that led me in this direction of internal family systems, Jyotish, and nature-based psychotherapy. And so my purpose here today is to propose an approach to astrological and Ayurvedic counseling that integrates internal family systems, which I will refer to as IFS. And this is an evidence-based model of psychotherapy, primarily developed by a guy named Richard Schwartz. It is my belief that Ayurveda and astrology enhance the clinical applications of IFS by providing an archetypal map that can guide both client and practitioner on an accelerated path towards holistic self-awareness and self-leadership. At the same time, practitioners of Ayurveda and astrology can use the concepts and vocabulary of IFS to illuminate the many varied aspects of their own psyche and lead their clients into a place of calm confidence and courageous curiosity, which are hallmarks of a healthy relationship with oneself, with others, and with the more than human world. So this is the plan. We will begin with an introduction of the core concepts of the IFS paradigm. Then we'll look at some theoretical applications of IFS for Ayurveda and Jyotish. Having covered the theoretical bases, we'll look at a case study to get an idea of how we might actually apply this approach in practice. And that leads us to a proposal for some further research, which is much needed if this is actually going to be viable and be of benefit to ourselves, each other, and humanity. So first, let's establish the essential tenets of the IFS worldview. So the basic concept is that the mind is multiple, and that this is a healthy state. It's not a sign of schizophrenia to have multiple voices in your head. That just like the body is one whole organism, but composed of many different parts. Right? You have a heart, you have a liver, you have bones and muscles. So is the psyche, one whole organism composed of many different parts. And the thing is, we don't actually want to integrate all the different parts. The same way you would not want to integrate your heart and liver, right? If you smash those two together inside your body, like that would be messy and you would not last very long. So same with the psyche. There are no bad parts. We're not trying to get rid of parts. The thing about these parts, IFS came from the early days of family therapy. And so these therapists were looking at family systems and seeing how all of the different parts of the family, mom, dad, daughter, dog, were in these dynamic relationships. And so when mom and daughter got together, they triangulated against dad. But then when it was just daddy-daughter day, everything was all good and they, exalted mom. And so all these parts are in different relations depending on how they relate. And if the dog is misbehaving, we don't get rid of the dog. You change the dynamic of the relationships, you shift the environment, because there's no such thing as a bad dog. There's just a dysfunctional environment. There's poor communication that's happening. So one of the core things to understand is that IFS is centered around the self. We use capital S, self. as this core essence, the center of gravity around which all of the other parts are orbiting. And every individual has a self. And the self should be leading the system, the same way the sun is zooming through space and all the planets are sort of zooming around it, following, right? There are infinite ways to define a self. For our purposes, we're focusing on an individual biopsychosocial complex organism, right? But every individual cell and atom in your body is one complete whole self made of parts. Your community, your family, your community, your country, your planet, your solar system, your cosmos are all these different boundary conditions that define a self, which are then composed of constituent parts. And so this is one of the powerful things about the IFS paradigm is we can apply it in so many different contexts. And it really is, there's a lot of, IFS is experiencing this surge in popularity because it's so widely applicable. And so there's somatic IFS, and now there's Ayurvedic and astrological IFS. So it's really important to define our boundaries, because if we don't know what is the boundary condition that we're working with, then we don't know where we belong. And we don't know which parts are ours, and do these parts belong here, or belong to this system? So it's important to define those boundaries, and what defines those boundaries is the capital S self. And so we'll talk about the qualities of the self in just a moment. So the other thing to mention is that parts are part of a system. And two ways to define a system is an entity with an internal and an external part. So there's me, and everything else is the not me. This is Buckminster Fuller's definition of a system, where there's an internal and an external. A cube has an inside and an outside, right? So that's one definition of a system. The other quality of a system is that you cannot change one thing without changing everything. You think of a tensegrity system, you poke one place and the whole system adjusts. And so you cannot change one relationship in a family system without changing every relationship. And everything we do internally ripples out externally. And so a shift in the external environment may change some internal relationships. Shifts in internal relationships, if all of a sudden you reintegrate an exiled part, and all of a sudden, like, oh, I'm really in touch with my artist part now, all of a sudden that may change the nature of your partnership or your parental relationship, right? So the internal and the external, as we know in Ayurveda, there's this fluid boundary. It's a selectively permeable boundary, isn't it? So that what's external becomes internal, and what's internal becomes external. And so there's this flowing dynamism between them. Okay, so this is the basic paradigm. We have this core capital S self and parts orbiting. And so how might we discriminate between self and parts? So the IFS Institute, Richard Schwartz himself comes up with these 8 C words to describe the qualities of the self. And so let's just go through them. Confidence. It's just like this basic okayness that, like, you're allowed to exist, and you don't have to apologize for being alive and taking up space and eating food, right? This is like basic confidence is a quality of the self. Curiosity, as opposed to fear or shame, right? How many of us have been afraid to ask a stupid question, and because it's embarrassing that I don't know something, I should know this, and I'm afraid that I'll get judged? Or you hear a thump in the night, and a curious person would get, oh, I wonder what that was. Maybe there's a friendly stranger at the door. But nope, I'm staying in bed. I'm going to pretend that's not there, right? So curiosity is the antidote to fear and shame. Calm, to be at ease, established in the self, that sva quality, right? The self is fundamentally calm, courageous. And the quality of courage is to to be willing to risk destabilization in service of growth or evolution. So I need a certain amount of confidence that I can reestablish equilibrium, and then I can have the courage to be like, cool, like I'll try something new. I'll take a risk. I'll put myself out there, because even if I get thrown off balance, I'm pretty sure I can restabilize and come back to myself. So then there's also this creative quality of the self, which is this playful, open to new ideas, sort of spontaneous quality. And whenever I touch into that creative sense, I think of my athletic career where it's like ready position and sort of like ready to move in any direction and respond spontaneously to whatever is going to happen. That's that creative sense, so that you're not fixed in some idea, well, it has to be this way. It's more of a manager part. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's more like, okay, this is what's happening. Let's juggle, and you can adjust. Creativity, compassion. Presence with one's own self allows for presence with others. Willingness to feel one's own feelings grants others permission to feel their feelings. And this word compassion literally means to feel together. And so to feel with someone is this capacity of the self, because the self is established there and can feel all their feels and is curious about what I'm feeling, curious about what you're feeling. How are these things in relationship? Clarity. So clarity has this discerning quality of like, okay, this is me, this is not me. This is for me, this is not for me. There's also this quality of transparency or integrity that comes with clarity. The self is not conniving, right? The self is quite open and like, yep, this is who I am. These are my motivations. This is what I'm trying to accomplish. And so that clarity is also a form of an integrity. And then there's this connected quality, which is, yes, connection to the inner self, connection to all of the different parts in orbit around that central self, to all of one's relations, human and more than human. This is also a connection to the living planet and the living cosmos, because if we think of these different definitions of a self, as these different boundary conditions, as a set of nested concentric spheres, if you are at the center of any one sphere, you are by definition at the center of every concentric sphere, right? If there's one sphere like this and I'm at the center, you can make a concentric sphere and I'm still at the center of that sphere too. And you go all the way out and all the way in. And so if we are rooted in that self, that svabhava, then we're by definition connected to every point in the cosmos, macro to micro. So that's sort of the ultimate ambition or potential of this work. And so I would invite you all to take a moment and meditate on these qualities and think or feel into a moment. And I wonder if a moment in your life, a situation comes to mind where you felt this, where you sort of had all of these qualities, you had this capacity. Maybe it was a challenging situation where you really showed up in a good way. Maybe it was a delightful situation and you just felt at ease and calm and confident and curious, and all these ways of being. I'm seeing some nods. Can everybody like feel what that is? Does everybody have a sense of what that capital S self feels like? Yeah. So stay with that for a moment. I want you to remember that situation in detail and really feel into it. Recall your emotional state. What did you say? What did you do that demonstrated these qualities? What was your posture? How were you sitting, standing? How did you move? This is the self. You have access to this at all times. And the assertion of IFS is that if anytime you are not operating from that self energy, then a part is running the show. Yeah. A part has hijacked, a part is driving the bus, right? And the self has been decentered somehow. And so, uh, you know, to be seated in the self really is the whole goal of yoga, isn't it? This something like svabhava, that establishment in the true nature of the self. And again, there are many ways to define that self, and it's perfectly valid to define it as just you, your mind-body complex. It could also be collapsed into this infinitely small single point of focus. It could be expanded to include the vastness of the whole cosmos, beyond the beyond, that irreducible I am presence. That is also one definition of the self. And again, if you can be rooted in the center, you are at the center of all that. For our purposes, we are focused on the individual psyche. And this is the starting point from which deeper, more expansive states of self-realization become more reliably available. So perhaps some of you are thinking, oh, geez, it feels like a pretty rare moment where I'm feeling calm and confident and curious and compassionate all at the same time. And really, like, these are rare moments in life, aren't they? And I just want to reassure you that it is perfectly normal that we are only operating from self-energy for moments at a time, seconds, minutes, if we're lucky. And the whole practice of IFS is to, as in your meditation practice, if you're sitting there and your mind is wandering, a core function of the meditation practice is just, okay, come back. Oh, it wandered again. Okay, come back. And come back and come back and come back. And the practice is to reduce the time and distance of that deviation, right? So if I lose my mind for 5 minutes in my 10-minute meditation, okay, maybe tomorrow I'll only lose it for 3 minutes, and then I'll come back, and then 2 minutes and 1 minute, and so same with self energy. So with this awareness, with this understanding and this embodied sense of what that capital S self feels like, we can be more quickly aware of when we deviate, when we're not in that self energy, and course correct more efficiently, more quickly, and gradually change the trajectory towards more and more self-leadership, self-establishment. Okay, so if we are only in self-energy for mere seconds at a time, it seems like a good idea for us to get familiar with our parts, if not fully befriend them. And so each individual has potentially unlimited parts. You can have thousands of different characters in your mind, in your heart, in bouncing around your psyche, yelling this opinion, suggesting that bad idea, all these different parts with their input. There are these three basic this umbrella archetypes within which we can categorize all other parts. And so we have exiles. Exiles are the subject of shadow work. Exiles are usually young parts that have experienced trauma. They are parts that bear burdens, that hold on to the shame, the terror, the sort of survival level terror of being alive, usually, surviving the war of childhood. Even those of us who had delightful childhoods still had to survive the war of childhood. It's a survival thing on a very core level. And there were parts of us that were deemed unacceptable. The precocious part, or the angry part, or the curious part that is annoying to a busy parent or something, and again, as parents, we do our best. And there's inevitably, we're here to mess up our children in just the right way, right? If we spend enough time studying Jyotish, we see that, cool, you had to have this parent because you needed this karma to, and so on, right? So these exiles are hiding or holding the unacceptable aspects of the psyche, and they are suffering for the sake of survival. It's like the princess who is locked in the tower for her own good, for the good of the kingdom, it's actually to protect the princess that we lock her away and don't let her out into the world, right? And so she has been exiled to the tower. And so she's isolated from the rest of the system. But what do we know about systems? You cannot change one thing without changing everything. And so exiling a part has an impact on the whole rest of the system. It distorts the system and pulls it out of balance. And so we have managers. Managers are proactive parts. They are the guard standing at the gate to the tower, making sure the princess stays up there and that nobody comes to rescue her. And managers are kind of our most common parts, kind of like the carbohydrates of our part system. They just they govern day-to-day functions. They exile the exile. They're aiming to keep control of every situation. They're the ones who want to control and make sure that everything's safe and organized, and so that you don't feel anything that you don't want to feel. And it can look like striving, controlling, evaluating, caretaking. Big difference between caretaking and caregiving, yeah? And it can also be this sort of terrorizing thing where this need for control becomes overwhelming. So our managers are basically trying to keep everything organized and in control. But life happens, and life is dynamic and sometimes chaotic, and managers can't always keep things in control. And so we have firefighters who are these reactive rescue parts who come in to rescue the exile when she's getting agitated or in danger of escaping. Firefighters come to maintain or reestablish safety when managers lose control. And so the aim is to regain control and shut down the feelings. When your house is on fire, the first thing you do is you put out the fire, right? You're going to damp that down without worrying about the damage that putting a fire blanket on it is going to do, right? So firefighters are often very destructive, and it shows up as emotional outbursts. We've heard a couple case study examples of like inappropriate emotions, right? Dysregulated responses, outsized responses to sort of normal situations. Drug and alcohol abuse is very much a firefighter behavior. Any sort of binging, self-harm, or shutting down. Self-harm is sort of the more rajasic approach. Shutdown is the more tamasic expression of a firefighter. So these are our basic overarching categories of parts. And again, you can have many, many exiles, many, many managers, many, many firefighters, but they're all in these basic categories. And so this is our basic paradigm. You have a self, which is composed of parts. And so what are we going to do about it? These are the goals of IFS. We want to first unblend, which is basically to notice the difference between yourself and your parts, and to create some spaciousness between them, because there's a big difference between saying, well, I want this and I want that, and they're incompatible, and I'm confused, and there's this tension in my mind, and it's giving me anxiety, and I don't know what to do, and I'm stuck. That's a very different conversation than saying a part of me is motivated by this, and a part of me really wants that. And these two different parts have different life stories, different motivations, different desires, and I can hold them all within my system and use the self to negotiate between them and facilitate a conversation, which is the role of the self. So once we can recognize the difference between self and parts, then we want to get to know our parts and familiarize ourselves with them the same way we would, we are meeting a bunch of nice new people at the conference, and we want to get to know, where are you from? What's your story? How'd you get to where you are? Motivations, desires, jobs, these sorts of things, specialties. And that unburdening process is to, usually we're trying to unburden exiles, right? Exiles are holding this huge burden of shame or terror, and it's usually unnecessary. Usually it's like, okay, we can take that off, we can redistribute that story is no longer true. We can reassign roles, we can redefine relationships, but that can only happen with leadership of the self. The self is the only one who can negotiate between other parts, because the parts are in their own dynamic relationships, and we need this central orbiting center of gravity to put things in their proper place. So an example of unburdening would be if you have a really powerful inner critic. An inner critic is a part, yeah? And this inner critic is perhaps protecting you from disappointment by not letting you apply for a job, for example. Because if you apply for the job and you don't get it, it's embarrassing. And maybe you told people that you applied for it and you really wanted it, and then you don't get it, and then they're going to think less of you and you're unworthy. And let's just protect you from all that by not even applying for it. And that's, where's the courage in that? Where's the curiosity? Where's the calm confidence in that? And so the self can help that inner critic perform a more preferable function. For example, saying, hey, inner critic, like, will you help me edit my resume so that there's no typos and it's really precise, and you can use all that critical energy to make this application perfect and figure out what they want to hear and bolster my credentials so that I have the best chance. Because you don't get a say of whether or not we're going to go for this life-changing opportunity or not, right? So that's an example of the self helping to unburden a part. Okay, that's our quick and dirty intro to IFS. And so let's look and see how we can apply this model elsewhere. Of course, we have to bring in the bard and this line, all the world's a stage. All the men and women merely players. They have their exits, their entrances, and one human in their time plays many parts. Indeed. Indeed we do. Okay. Here's the thing. Perhaps you've already started connecting some of the dots about how IFS and Ayurveda can be interwoven. And so let's take a minute to talk about how we can use IFS to enhance and fine-tune our Ayurvedic awareness of self and of others. So life is kaleidoscopic. And what I mean by that is that each part contains the whole, right? We talked about it, it's a fractal. It goes all the way out and all the way in. And one of the great powers of Ayurveda is to provide a conceptual framework and vocabulary that can accurately describe phenomena at every scale of existence, right? So look at this graphic showing these nested spheres. They're circles, but let's pretend it's three-dimensional. Moving from the cosmic down to the individual parts. And of course, there are many subdivisions in between, but for the purposes of time, let's keep it simple. So at the cosmic level, we can recognize each planet in our solar system as having a particular doshic constitutions. We recognize elements, doshas and gunas, in our planets in the solar system. Here on Earth, we describe different climate zones and ecosystems using the tridosha system. Gunas in the atmosphere, in the ecosystem, right? Within the realm of humanity, we can see how sociocultural trends ebb and flow, like a collective Prakriti-Vikriti relationship. How's it going in the US right now? Tridoshically provoked? Yeah, anybody? Anybody? Yeah, okay, anyway. Then, of course, we can analyze an individual according to their unique ratio of doshas. This is our most common application of Ayurvedic principles. And that's usually where the analysis ends. And so what I'm here to suggest is that as we get to know our internal parts, one of the things we want to know about them is their Ayurvedic constitution. If you have a manager who's trying to run the show and control things all the time, it sounds like a pretty pitta-provoked part, yeah? And maybe they are an authentically pitta-prakriti with just way too much pitta going on. And so how can we get to know that part and work with them to soothe that pitta on that internal level and penetrate that one layer deeper than just this sort of like, okay, well, you're pitta kapha, and so that's who you are. We can get way more specific than that, because when I read my pulse, I'm a tridoshic pitta kapha, but I definitely have vata parts. I definitely have, there's all these different constitutions that live within me in different areas, in different roles, at different moments. So, um, yeah, this brings up, okay. uh, This brings up the importance of recognizing each part as a fully formed individual, and to respect them as such, and understand that they have a full life history, and that parts are usually formed at some traumatic moment or in childhood, and to recognize that they have a unique identity, and to be really curious. What's their prakriti? What's their vikriti? How can we get to know them well? And that's how we're going to be able to help them from that self energy. And this approach may also be helpful for cases when prakriti is difficult to determine. I talk to a lot of people, and I'm sure in this crowd we are those people and have talked to these people who, well, I took 3 different online dosha quizzes, and one says I'm each of each dosha, and I don't know what I am, and I'm confused, and it feels like this, but I'm also like that. This is the pretty common experience, right? And so isn't it possible that depending on which part was active when they were taking this test, they got one score and the other part was active? Maybe they were speaking from the self when they did one, but if they don't know how to identify the difference between self and parts, how are they going to know? And they might have a different psychological prakriti than their physical prakriti. And so this language of IFS, of self and parts, helps us to break down and get really specific and precise with the dosha system, with the gunas. I really find that using gunas is most helpful in a clinical setting, where when I'm speaking with someone and we can hear a part come up, like, okay, let's talk about the qualities of this part. Oh, they're really sharp. They're sort of dull and sleepy. Okay, so let's use the language of Gurvadi Guna to be really accurate about describing these parts, and then we can lead back to dosha constitution and so on. Okay, that's a super simple suggestion for how the integration of IFS can enhance Ayurvedic self-inquiry and clinical practice. I believe there's a great deal more to explore here, but time. So let's get to the juiciness of the Jyotish. Okay, so Jyotish provides a map of archetypes that can shortcut the unblending process. If you're sitting at home and somebody says, "What do you want for dinner?" and it's sort of like infinite possibilities, that can be a little bit debilitating. And how are you supposed to pick one? If somebody hands you a menu and says, "Here, choose from one of these 7 things," that actually makes it a little bit easier to get in touch with what you actually want. Even if it's like, "Cool, well, I want something like this, but it's a little bit augmented," right? So that's what Jyotish can offer, is in the clinical setting, instead of being dependent upon the client to come up with their own parts, we can offer them some suggestions. We can guide a little bit and use that astrological vocabulary to add texture and describe these archetypes and lead clients very quickly in the direction of self-recognition. So for example, if I'm looking at a chart and sitting in front of a person, I might start describing the qualities of Mars. And okay, are you familiar with a part of you that has this quality of ambition and fierceness and discipline, but also a little bit of rage and anger sometimes? And like, oh yeah. And then looking at the chart, I can see like that usually shows up more at work than it does at home, doesn't it? Right? And all of a sudden, and then sure enough, Jyotish works, and so it becomes this deep insight into the astrology chart is basically a map of parts, right? And so here we see this really simplified summary of the 7 planets, being the sun, moon, and 5 elementals, obviously excluding Rahu and Ketu from this list. They definitely have a special role to play in this area for future research and development of this model. what I found really interesting was just how effortlessly those C-word descriptions of the self correspond quite neatly to the planets. It didn't, this, this is not advanced research. I looked at that list of words and I looked at the list of planets and I was like, oh, isn't Mercury curious? Isn't Mars courageous? Isn't the moon compassionate? Doesn't the sun give both confidence and clarity? The sun comes up and all of a sudden you can see. Jupiter creates connectedness, right? As the ethereal planet ruling the ether element, space is not what separates us. Space is what connects us, right? We are not separated by empty space. We are connected by ether, right? And so this is the realm of Jupiter that fills this dense emptiness between us. And so Jupiter creates that connectedness and also the ability to connect ideas and make meaning. This is Jupiter's role as well. Venus, that creative one who gets really creative in pursuit of the perfection of pleasure. Yeah. And then Saturn, whose qualities include patience and this just sort of like slow determinism where we're going to get through your whole karmic history one painful day at a time. Saturn is very, very calm in this way. And so, again, as a very, very surface level suggestion, I would invite you to recognize that without doing any fancy meditation, without doing any further self-inquiry, you have a Mars part, and you have a Venus part, and you have a Saturn part, and you have a Mercury part. And the more you learn about the archetypes of the planets, what are their, what areas of life are they interested in? What are their qualities? How do they interact with the world? And then specifically in your chart, this is this shortcut to parts work. And you can cut right to the core issue, as opposed to, years of therapy and slowly teasing it out and unblending, which again is powerful. And this is one of the things we'll get to when we get to the case study is lessons learned, is that we must go at the pace of the self. The client's self must determine the pace that we go. And one of the lessons learned is sometimes the astrology chart is too accurate. And if you see me coming like this, your shields go up, right? And so it sort of has to be that sort of thing, right? In the nicest way, in service of your evolution and healing, right? Okay. Just as each individual is composed of all three doshas, we are all composed of every planet, and every planet is a divine force expressing different qualities of the self. So if we're going to talk about mental health in Jyotish, we must give special attention to the three sattvic planets, Sun, Moon, Jupiter. So Jupiter, as that space creator, is vital for the process of unblending, to create good space. We just heard Dr. Ram Kumar talk about good space. Yeah, this is Jupiter's job, to create that good space. And in between our parts, we want that good space. We need to unblend. So there's this entangled, knotted ball of self and parts. And as we tease it apart, there has to be space to move into. So this is Jupiter's role to support healthy unblending. The moon is a vital component of the capital S self as well, given that it is the psycho-emotional sensitivity of the moon that allows us to distinguish between parts. And here's the thing, parts most often arise as thoughts and feelings. Very rarely are you going to get a psychedelic vision of a fully formed individual dressed in costume saying, "Hi, I'm your manager part, and I want you to know this about me." No, it's much more subtle than that, and it arises in different circumstances and in the form of thoughts and feelings. And this is and interpretations of events, right? And this is the realm of the moon. And an afflicted moon distorts that filter of perception. makes a person unable or unwilling to see their parts accurately. And when we see an afflicted moon in the chart, we want to be very careful about how we deliver good or bad news, because the good news may be interpreted negatively, and everything is sad. And again, we've been talking about mental health, and if someone is in a depressive rut, no matter what you tell them, it's going to lead to unworthiness and trouble. So the status of the moon is very, very important, and it's also the moon as that compassionate one allows us to unburden, because we have to have compassion for our exiled parts, even if they've been causing huge damage. If our firefighter has been causing incredible damage in our life, in order to unburden that firefighter, say, hey, you don't have to rescue me in that situation. This person is actually just trying to love me, and please don't rescue me from that situation. We have to have compassion for the motivation of that firefighter who's really trying to help you, and they just have an outdated assignment. And so we have to connect and feel with them in order to invite them into a new role. So the moon helps us unburden, and then the sun is the most obvious indicator of that capital S self, or the sun around which all the other parts are in orbit. And the sun provides discernment, clarity, is that gravitational force, shows capacity for confidence, that self-sourced authority, that leadership. And so the sun is the planet that helps us with that self-leadership piece. So there are our 3 goals of IFS therapy: unblending, unburdening, self-leadership, in the form of Jupiter, Moon, Sun. So those are sort of like where we would go first. And when we're looking at mental health issues in a chart, those are really the 3 planets that we look to first. Of course, as we develop the model more deeply, we can look at the dignity and mood of each planet, the avastha of the planets in a chart, to influence the way that particular energy expresses, right? So will Mercury show up as curious, or will that aspect of self be distorted? If Mercury is debilitated, for example, like maybe they're not going to be as curious, and that aspect of self shows up more as fear or avoidance, or speaking around it, or not just asking the question, right? So depending on the dignity, the avastha, a planet could show up as that quality of the self, or it could express as an overbearing manager or a traumatized exile if it's cursed, combust, these sorts of things. So this again is the deeper analysis, and as we get more charts and do more practice with this, we can start to see the ways that these things really show up and look for the consistent indicators. And of course, talking about individual planets, no planet stands alone in a chart. They're all part of the solar system and your internal family solar system. And so they're all interrelated, and they have friends and enemies. And so, like we said at the start, one of the primary precepts is that of IFS is that parts are part of a system. And this example of, mom and daughter get together, and when they're together, they're talking noise about dad, but then dad and daughter get together and it's all happy. And so, for example, the planets also have these relationships. And this is straight out of classical text, right? This particular chart comes from my teacher Freedom, but this is straight out of Parashara. And so, for example, the moon is perfectly happy when visiting Gemini or Virgo, the signs ruled by Mercury. But when Mercury is in Cancer, the sign ruled by the moon, that's not a nice relationship. So it's like, great, like when I come over to your house, we're super friendly and then you're getting along great and you feed me dinner. But when you come over to my house, I like make you do yard work, right? Like what is, and so, okay, we see that in the Jyotish. We know that relationship, like in family systems and in our like social relationships as well. And isn't it interesting how like sometimes that's okay, right? If I'm getting nourishment from over here, I can be more of service over here. I don't necessarily need the person I'm serving to serve me back, as long as I'm getting stabilized within the sort of matrix of the whole system, right? So there's an appropriateness to this. And so we just want to again, bring that into the internal system and recognize that your internal parts are also having these relationships. All of your internal parts also have complicated relationships with each other. And if you unburden one part and give them a new job, some other part might get jealous or be like, hey, they're stepping on my toes. You can't do that. And so again, you can't change one thing without changing everything. And so everything is dynamic like this. Okay. With me? Okay, cool. Um, Having discussed some of these abstract principles, let's look at a real life case study. So, 36-year-old female. And so this is the same chart, just North and South Indian style. For those of you with a preference and familiarity with one or the other. And so, again, we could. A chart is an infinitely recursive mirror, right? We can spend the rest of the weekend talking about a chart. But just cursory glance, three things that jump out right away. One is Venus and Mercury in the Lagna, which is Libra, right? So we've got Lagnesha in the Lagna. So we have the Lord of the first house in the first. This is Panchamahaprusha Yoga and creates a lot of power. Venus at full strength. She was born on Friday. So her Vara Lord is also Venus. Like this, if this person is not the embodiment of Venus, I do not know who is. We've got a Libra ascendant, Venus in the Lagna, born on Friday. Venus is her Atmakaraka, the soul indicator planet. So it's a Venus Panchamahaprusha Yoga. Venus and Mercury together, aspected by Jupiter, and Mercury's creating a Raja Yoga. All this happening right in that first house. And so one thing we know immediately about this person is she is beautiful and kind, friendly. That Venus and Mercury together is she's nice and personable and friendly and like genuinely wants to get along. And that Libra quality, right? It's like let's connect. And that Panchamahaprusha Yoga gives her like the power of a politician in that way, in the ability to like, let's connect. And she can connect with anybody because she's deeply friendly and wants to communicate and get along. So, okay, yeah, kind, personable, friendly, nice, beautiful. First thing. Okay, next thing. There's a second Panchamahaprusha Yoga with exalted Mars in the fourth house. Exalted Mars, the warrior at full strength in the place, that fourth house is like literally physically home, but it's also where we find contentment within the self, right? It's literally got to do with happiness and that basic okayness. And to have an exalted Mars there, like her, that power, that her inner critic has superpowers, right? And it's like the 5-star general feels like home, right? She like that's this 5-star general, exalted Mars, Panchamahaprusha Yoga in that fourth house. So it feels really at home to be in that sort of like military discipline, that precision, and that can also be a very powerful inner critic. There's also Parivartana Yoga with the second house Saturn happening. So this is adding a bit of Vata to the Pitta. And so what happens when we add wind to fire? It just blows it up a little bit, and that brings a little bit of that stress, anxiety. And also like with Saturn's influence, there's a little bit of a merciless quality. Like Saturn doesn't care if you're suffering. Learn your karmic lessons and, deal with it. So okay. Mars is also the ruler of the seventh in the fourth. So again, in relationship, fighting feels normal. I actually feel at home when we're arguing and fighting, right? And that fighter is the 5-star general, one of the best fighters possible in the world, right? Ninja warrior. Okay, so those are the two most like big obvious things. Does anybody see the third most obvious thing that I'm going to go to? Sun, moon in the 12th. What else is in the 12th? What does that mean? She was born 3 hours before an eclipse. When the nodes join with the sun and moon, that's an eclipse. And so this is an eclipse in her 12th house. And so do you think she and we talked about the importance of the sun and moon for that self identity. So do you think that maybe she has some confusion about her true identity? Do you think maybe the luminaries in her chart being engulfed in shadow maybe adds a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of this unsureness about, like, is this who I am? Is this who I am? It's in shadow. There's not quite that confidence and clarity that the sun wants to bring. It's a solar eclipse, right? That 12th house, K2 in the 12th, we like that generally. And K2 moon in the 12th even, like, gives really nice, like, intuitive capacities, like kind of like she could almost be a channeler, right? So there's this otherworldly aspect, which could also be like, is she channeling or is she dissociating, right? And how would we know the difference? Okay, so those just, like, again, quick and dirty read of the chart, right? I was very, very pleased one day poking around on the IFS Institute website to find that they have developed an IFS scale test, sort of like a Myers-Briggs test for IFS. And so I asked our case study, our embodiment of Venus, to take that test. And these are the results. And so on the left-hand side there, you will see that there are these 8 different sort of like sub parts. And all of the experienced experts in the IFS community got together and they correlated all of their experiences and came up with these 8 parts that are the most common sort of subparts that we can basically categorize. And I've highlighted just a few of them. The first thing to look at is, the top and bottom. You see the relative expression of self versus parts, and self is the lowest thing, and parts is not the highest thing, but up there, right? So she's operating less from self, more often from parts. Now, one thing I'll say, this is very common. This is very common for someone who has not been doing IFS therapy for a significant period of time. It's perfectly normal. I suspect if everybody in this room took this test, we would have a very similar outcome of self relative to parts. And it's notable when we see the sun and moon being eclipsed, we wouldn't expect her to have a really strong self. We wouldn't expect, self to be all the way up here, would it? Would we? Like, we expect it to be like struggling to find that core self. Okay. What's the first thing we said? She's friendly, nice, kind. What's the highest rating that she got? Pleasing. The shadow side of being pleasing is abandoned or self-abandoning. And isn't this just the archetypal Libra thing, where it's like, I want to get along so much, I abandon myself and give you everything. I want the scales to be balanced, and so I'll give you everything I've got, right? This is this sort of like, shadow side of Libra. And so this pleasing part, where, and again, it's confusing, like, she's authentically kind. Like, this is deeply encoded in her chart. She's, really authentic. That is part of her authentic self. And here it shows up. That's the part that she operates from most often. And so is she getting the best expression of that authentic aspect of herself? Probably not, right? But could we unburden that pleasing, self-abandoning part a little bit and get her to connect with that authentically compassionate part? Definitely. And then she can really live from that confident place where she's still kind and nice and generous and all that, but without abandoning herself in the process. Okay. The next highest one, the next 2 highest ones are raging and self-critical. Mars? Mars, anybody? Exalted Mars? What are we, all the ninja warrior, 5-star general who feels like home? And again, this is the power of IFS, where previously she might have said, well, yeah, I'm just like that. Okay, well, a part of you operates that way. And is that your preference? Do you want to be operating from that part without choosing it? And again, this is ultimately on a very simple level, and you all can start doing this immediately. You don't need to go study IFS to start doing this, is to just simply observe, unblend, notice whether I'm operating from self or part. Then I can choose if that part is playing a helpful role or not, or if I can choose to operate from self, and then I can take action. Observe, choose, act, as opposed to the sort of like fire, ready, aim thing that we so often do when our parts have hijacked and are driving the bus. It's the self that can choose and then act. Okay, and then the last one that I've highlighted here, the other one that's above high, is dissociation. And so these three things that I've highlighted in conversations, in these sessions, we did a bunch of sessions together, and my understanding is that it's been very, very fruitful, and I expect that we're going to continue because we've been churning through a bunch of issues, and there's been these revelations coming up and connections being made, and these, so we're going to keep going. But what we figured out is that the pleasing, abandoning one, that Venus part, is the exile, actually. And the self-critical part is the manager, keeping everything organized and that. And then the dissociation is the firefighter, the one who comes to the rescue. When things start to get out of control, dissociate. I'm gone. I was born on an eclipse. I'm not of this world anyway. Well, I don't need to be here. This is really uncomfortable. And I don't know who I am anyway. So peace out, right? And so this points us to one of the primary lessons that I've learned so far. I mentioned it already, is as the practitioner, we want to guide and not lead. We want to prompt and not lead the witness, right? Because in the first 5 minutes of the first session, I looked at her chart and I was like, all right, tell me about your princess part. Because that Venus is the princess and it's so powerful, and it's just cool, finger right on it. And the response was literally this, oh, no, I don't know what you're talking about. No, the princess is my sister. My sister's the princess. I'm not the princess. And as soon as you hear that revulsion and no, I'm not that. It's oh, exile, shadow part, right? And as we kept working on it and talked through it, we found that this princess part had been exiled because there was associations of shame, embarrassment, being, the daughter of a doctor and beautiful in public school is embarrassing, right? She didn't want to be the beautiful rich girl. And so she and what is a princess but beautiful and rich, right? And so she exiled that part. I am not that. To protect myself, in order to find acceptance and belonging, this part had to get locked in the tower in order for me to survive the war of childhood and adolescence, especially. And so in subsequent sessions, as we've continued working on it, there's been this amazing revelation of these princess parts and the acceptance of it, and how she's working and evolving to embrace those parts in her adulthood and reintegrating them and giving her a different job and really celebrating that Venusian part. It's a beautiful thing. So that's one case study. That's just the first example that I've got, but it works. It just matches up so nice. So my proposal would be to have hundreds of people, thousands of people with accurate birth times take this IFS scale profile test. Then let's start analyzing charts and see what consistent patterns we can find, and correlate active subparts with prominent afflicted planets or prominent yogas. And that seems like a really great research project. So, the IFS Institute does have a thing where they're accepting research proposals. So as soon as we're done here, I'm going to go type that in. And that is what I came here to say to you. And I'm right at time. So thank you for your time and attention.